Hello and welcome to Every on Campus's Map Day. This is our first volunteer map day, and it's a really big step in launching our new campus accountability map, our school accountability map, and we're really excited that you're here with us. So in a minute, we're going to talk about our brand new school accountability map and all the cool stuff it's going to do. And we'll also give you some information about things you should know about Title IX that will help you fill out the map. But first, I wanted to introduce ourselves. My name is Hanna, and I'm the Campus Policy Manager here at Henry on campus.
Hi, I'm Betsy. I'm a rising college sophomore, and I'm here with EROC this summer to be Campus Data Fellow. I'm the person you guys have been emailing a lot. It's my job to work with volunteers on this map, and I will be using my phone during this live stream to receive questions from you guys.
My favorite fun fact about Title IX is that it was established actually, or the case law that led up to it, the cases that made it possible, were established using men's rights. Not surprisingly at all, when people were trying to move public opinion to accept more women into medical schools and law schools, the way that this sort of because of sex doctrine got traction, the way people started paying attention to like maybe we should protect people because of their sex, was because there were men who were being denied certain things because of their sex. Most famously in a case about buying beer, a low alcohol beer, it's called near beer, it's like 3.5% alcohol. Women were allowed to buy it at age 18 and men were not allowed to buy it until they were 21. And that case was one of the most formative cases in using this because of sex lens to understand discrimination. So Title IX was originally implemented to allow access to women to professional schools, specifically law school and medical school were the first pieces of why Title IX was originally enacted. It has expanded so much since 1972 and is often most famously known for sports. A lot of people who know Title IX know it as that law that makes sure that you have girls' teams or women's teams as well as men's and boys' teams in a sort of equal amount or a representative amount is actually what the law requires. But it's evolved since then. Since about the early 90s, and even a little bit before, the law has been used to address sexual violence on schools, campuses that are K-12 schools. Betsy mentioned earlier, this applies to K-12 as well as higher education. And it has evolved even in the last decade or so, most notably under the Obama administration and then beyond that, to address all kinds of different sexual violence that occur on schools, campuses, and in schools' educational programs. So that's kind of how we got to where we're at today. There's another law that's important to mention that you will run across in your filling out of these forms. We ask for data about this. It's called the Clery Act. And that act was passed in 1990. It's another federal law, and it's supposed to encourage schools to be more transparent about what kinds of crime occur at their institutions. So the Clery Act has a reporting requirement. Schools, higher education schools, are required to yearly tell everyone how many of certain kinds of crimes occur on campus. This is everything from rape and certain kinds of sexual violence to fires, muggings, theft, things like that. There are some important limitations to mention with the Clery Act. This act only covers crimes that happen within what is often known as Clery geography, meaning that if you look at a school on a map and you draw a dotted line around the campus, the school is only required to report crimes that happen inside of that dotted line. This goes as far as preventing schools or not requiring schools to report crimes that happen like in an alleyway that's just outside of the school, that even is adjacent to the school. So it's very limited in scope physically. And also, since it only requires schools to disclose crime and very particular crimes that are named in the act, there's lots of other kinds of very harmful behavior and other kinds of sexual violence that are not included under the Clery Act, including many kinds of sexual harassment that wouldn't rise to the level of being a crime under the federal rules. So all that to say, it's important. The Clery Act requires schools to tell us what crimes exist on their campus. Some schools do not comply with this. There is a hefty fine. There are some people in Washington and Congress who are trying to increase the fine to encourage schools to disclose. But also we should take those numbers with a grain of salt, so to speak. They may not be representative of your own experience. They may not be representative of an experience of a friend of yours. You may see those numbers and think, wow, those are really low, or wow, those are really high, or how many people have stolen things from this dorm? I have no idea. Those are all experiences you may have while looking at the Clery Act numbers, but it's an important tool that we can use to help sort of get a pulse on what is happening on college campuses. That covers Title IX and Clery Act for me, isn't it?
Just that anytime you might get an email or a text alert from your school that talks about some sort of crime, whether it be, for my school's fire, I go to school in California, so, fires, gas leaks, or indecent exposure, those are all covered by the Clery Act.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's how that alert system was established. Let's move on to talk a little bit about the Department of Education. You may have heard a little bit about it. You may know the name Betsy DeVos, and she is the person who is currently in charge of the Department of Education. She was appointed by Donald Trump last year. Is that right? 2018? 2017. It's been almost 2 years. Phew. And this is a federal agency. So the way I always explain this is that a while ago, Congress realized that if they were responsible for making and finalizing every single law that existed, they would be even less prolific than they currently are. So they decided that they would give agencies the authority to make their own rules. They said, okay, we can't all be experts about education, but I bet that we could have the executive branch, the president, find some experts, make some administrations, and then we can let them make all the rules about education. So that's what happened. So Congress authorized that, which means that the Department of Education, as well as lots of other departments like the Department of Energy, exist under the executive branch of the government, and they make their own laws. They set the tone for how we deal with the environment, for how we deal with education, for how we deal with a lot of other things as well. And the Department of Education oversees how well schools implement Title IX and is there to hold schools responsible for not following Title IX correctly. The way that this happens has changed a little bit as the new administration has taken over the Department of Education. So schools, the administration itself is responsible for saying to schools, hey, you're violating Title IX. The school could have its funding taken away if it is found to be in violation of Title IX. However, that has never actually happened in the entire time that this provision has existed. And under this administration, we have seen the Department of Education not going aggressively after schools to try to get them to comply with Title IX. Under the Obama administration, there were many schools, a few hundred, I believe, that had federal investigations opened against them, where the administration said, we want to learn more about how you're dealing with sexual violence on your campus, and we're going to spend some time and some resources to do that. Those investigations, some of them completed, some of them have not completed, and they have not really moved in the last 2 years since President Trump has been in office. All of that sort of that you might have been hearing about recently, about schools being investigated for not following Title IX, is a little bit on hold. So that's another reason why this map is so important, because this allows us as people involved in the movement to end sexual violence, and as people on campuses and at schools and in educational settings, to learn about what is going well and what isn't, to do that thing that we were talking about earlier, to see what other schools are doing better or differently than your own, especially important in a time where the Department of Education is not as transparent as it has been in the past and is not working as hard to ensure that campuses are safe for people of all genders and that educational access is not cut off for any individual. That's another important reason that this map exists. One more thing about the Department of Education, and then we'll move on to something a little more fun. You may also hear about the Office for Civil Rights. This is a part of the Department of Education. There's an office within the Department of Education that is specifically in charge of making sure that Title IX is complied with. So in the past, students can still do this, although it is not as useful as it once was. Students would file a complaint with the Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Education, saying, hey, I experienced some sort of barrier to my education because of my sex, and I complained to the school like I was supposed to, and the school didn't do anything, or didn't do the right thing, or did something it wasn't supposed to. And you could kind of tell, so to speak, on your school to the department, and then the department would open one of these investigations. And that is a mechanism that a lot of students were using recently to help push their schools to be better under Title IX. But that mechanism, as I mentioned earlier, is not so useful anymore. This current administration is not really pursuing the investigation of any of those complaints. So we need to be creative and think about other ways that we can push our schools, push our communities, and push the administration to be better on sexual violence. Do you have anything to add about the Department of Education? One of my favorite topics.
Just that it makes me sad to share a name with Betsy DeVos, but yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. All right, let's move on to talk about, this is number 3, the third thing that you should know about Title IX. We have talked about what Title IX is. We have talked about how it's enforced, the Department of Education, the Office of Civil Rights. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what it does and what it says. So the first thing that I want to talk about is Title IX offices and Title IX coordinators. I'm going to pop over to you to see what you have to say about Title IX coordinators.
All right. So every federally funded educational institution is required to have a Title IX coordinator, who is someone who makes sure that the school is complying with Title IX regulations. It's important to acknowledge that not all Title IX coordinators are equipped to handle their jobs. Some have been uniquely trained to be Title IX coordinators and are trauma-informed. Others, maybe for administrators at smaller schools with less funding, being a Title IX coordinator is just another thing that they have to do. It's just another administrative duty, and they have, a million of them. So the range of quality of care that Title IX coordinators can provide is very wide. The Title IX office is the office that houses the Title IX coordinator and is designed to receive and process and investigate Title IX complaints. So if you have been sexually harassed, or you feel like your rights under Title IX have been violated in any other way, you would go to the office to file a complaint. But due to variations in size and funding resources, not all schools have a Title IX office.
Yeah, that's important to mention. And also Title IX coordinator, as you said, is sometimes a role all by itself, and is sometimes many people's roles, solely many people's roles, or many people's roles in addition to other responsibilities that they have, as you said. And Title IX somewhat recently, in the last few years, has sort of been changed a little bit. The way that Title IX is enforced has been changed a little bit to make it that schools are required to have a coordinator on their campuses. But it's been a little tricky, as you mentioned, for schools. Many schools are trying the best they can to get these folks on campus and to get them trained. There are lots of barriers, as you mentioned, in size and funding, but also some schools are not taking it super seriously and don't have the sort of culture and the support to train and implement Title IX coordinator in a real useful way. So while it is required that your school has one, it may be difficult to find that person. There may be many people. They may have their own office, they may have a whole staff, or it may just be someone who's also in charge of discipline or academics or admissions or any number of other things on campus. It's a real wide-ranging role. It's important to note here too that Title IX coordinators are also required in K-12 settings. So every school district at the K-12 level should also have a Title IX coordinator, and that should be made public on a website. So somewhere on that school's website or that district's website, you should be able to find that person. That is not always the case. So if you are having trouble, you're curious and just Googled your high school and can't find your Title IX coordinator, if you've got connections there, feel free to give someone a shout and say, hey, who's my Title IX coordinator? Because the students at those schools also deserve to know who they can report to should they experience any kind of Title IX violation. So, a Title IX coordinator is a person on campus or at a school or in an educational setting who is responsible for making sure the school is complying with the law, who's making sure that the school's following the law and providing all the resources that they should. One of the ways that they do this is by hearing complaints from students and investigating them. And that's a thing that you may have heard a lot about in the news, and in media in general, and also from friends. This is a process that happens frequently to address sexual violence on campus. Not every instance of sexual violence is reported. There are many reasons why students may or may not report, and we can get into those later on. But the ones that are often written in some way in a formal complaint, often given to the Title IX coordinator, and then there may be an investigation of that complaint. And I'm wondering, Betsy, if you want to talk a little bit about investigations. Tell us what you know.
Yeah, so there are many different models of investigation that schools choose to employ. You can have the single investigator model, where one investigator would ask questions to both the named harasser and the complainant. I don't know if that's what you would say.
Yeah, the person who is saying that their rights were violated and the person that person identified as having harm to them, the complainant and the named harasser, yeah.
Yeah, another model would be dual investigator, where one investigator is assigned to the named harasser's side, so to speak, and one investigator is in charge of asking questions to the complainant. And then dual investigator plus is a term that we kind of coined here. Yeah, do you want to take that?
Sure. And that's a process where there's one investigator for each side. The survivor has an investigator, the named harasser has an investigator. But those investigators sort of write up a report of what they found and give that information to another person or set of people who makes a decision about what's going to happen with that. So the difference between dual investigator and a dual investigator plus model is that the dual investigator model, the two investigators will make a decision about if there is a finding of responsibility and what will happen with each of those parties, with both the survivor and the named harasser. In the dual investigator plus model, they'll write up a report about what they found and then usually hand it over to a panel of folks on campus, usually made up of administrators, sometimes professors, sometimes deans. It varies. There may be 3 people, there may be 5 people, there may be 1 person, and that panel of people will kind of take in all of the data that they got from the investigators and make a decision about responsibility and potential sanctions. If some of these terms of finding responsibility, sanctions aren't quite making sense to you yet, fear not, we'll get to it.
I just want to interrupt for a second.
Sure.
To give another shout out to Andrea, who is an advocate that EROC partners with at the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence. We're so lucky to have powerhouse partners like you. Thank you for commenting. Thank you for participating.
Awesome. Hi, Andrea. Let's move on to our next thing to talk about, our 4th thing to know about Title IX, which is actually kind of Title IX adjacent, which is what is a climate survey? There are questions on the form that you'll be filling out to add your school to the map that ask about climate surveys. Betsy, what the heck is a climate survey?
And why does it matter?
And why does it matter?
Yeah. So a climate survey is basically intended to help schools better understand the problem of sexual harassment on their campuses. It's a survey that asks students about their experiences with sexual misconduct, with the Title IX process, etc. Schools will often try to write their own climate surveys, which I don't think is the best model because it doesn't prevent, the influence of bias. A lot of schools will employ an outside party. The Association of American Universities is one. They've written a climate survey that a number of different schools use, different schools using the same survey also allows students to better compare numbers between schools, which is really important as well. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that was a really great overview. A couple interesting things about climate surveys is that they aren't, as you mentioned, standard. So while a school creating their own can often be problematic because there's bias, having an outside party can also be problematic because they don't always know what the best questions are to ask of a particular student body to get the best information about what's actually happening at that school. This is sort of a solution to the problem that the Clery Act points to, which is that oftentimes we don't really know how prevalent sexual violence actually is on a campus and what kinds of harassment students are experiencing. So the climate survey tries to remedy that a little bit by being sent directly to students and asking lots of questions about experiences that they have had. There are some drawbacks to this, however. So while the Clery Act is imperfect because it doesn't give us a full picture, it omits lots of locations where harassment occurs, it omits a lot of different kinds of harassment that occur. The climate survey also is a useful but not perfect tool that is not uniform, so it can be really hard to compare apples to apples, so to speak. And that's sometimes good because schools are very, very different, but that sometimes is bad because it means that it's hard to make sense of the data when looking at it next to each other. Also, the folks who fill out climate surveys on campuses, the students at schools who fill out these surveys, are often a little bit of a self-selecting group. Anyone who works in higher education or who is attending an institution of higher education may know that it sometimes can be hard to get college students to do stuff, especially extra stuff outside of all of their obligations for being a student. So while many schools do send out climate surveys, they frequently happen every 2 years, but schools have different ways of approaching it. They often don't have a super high return rate. So maybe 15% or 20% of students will respond to the survey, which is helpful, but is definitely only a slice of the population. And often the students who do fill out the survey are students who are already aware of what's happening on campus, are already a little bit aware of their rights, are already involved in Title IX processes, might be involved in women's or gender centers on campus. There's sort of a group of people who sort of like in the know about it already, often. Not always the case. Sometimes, and certain schools do a really good job of trying to get students to take these surveys in classes and find other creative ways to incentivize them to get a more broad picture of what's happening. But they're definitely a useful but not perfect tool. But if you have a school that you're filling out the form for and they have a climate survey, we would love to have it. So hit the download button on that puppy and upload it onto our form. And we will put it on the map, so you'll be able to see what the Clery numbers say, what the climate survey says, and what the policies are at that school, and that can help you also get a sense of how these different tools are used to address sexual violence. Let's move on to the fifth thing you should know about Title IX, and that is SANE exams. This is something else that's on your form to fill out. SANE stands for Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner, and it's a forensic exam that is performed by someone who's been trained to do this kind of exam. A SANE exam results in what is frequently casually called a rape kit. That's the idea of what is being collected is evidence, DNA, information about what happened to a particular person. So this is one thing that a student who's experienced sexual violence may choose to use. Some schools provide SANE nurses on their campuses, people who've been trained in these kinds of exams. But if that is not the case, there are often nurses, SANE nurses at hospitals and neighboring medical institutions. This is as we said, one way that a person might address sexual violence or might take a step to heal from sexual violence and to find justice. It is one in a variety of options and can be really useful, and also is something that some folks choose not to do because they can't figure out where to get one done, they can't afford it, they don't have transportation to get to a place where it's being offered, they have a gender presentation that is not typical, or that is not binary, and they feel like they don't necessarily want to engage in that kind of exam. There are lots of reasons why a student may not choose to do it, but it is one tool that is available to students. On a similar topic, we'll also mention that there's something called a forensic rape exam. You may hear that instead of SANE. That's kind of the same thing, collecting the evidence, collecting data to put in a rape kit. And one other thing that I want to mention, just because it's in the news a little bit here and there, that rape kits are collected often and can be a tool. However, there's also a lot of mishandling of rape kits themselves. We've heard lots of stories of municipalities like Baltimore County locally having a whole bunch of them on shelves that were never actually used or tested. So if this is an option that you or someone you know wants to pursue, totally reasonable, such a great option. Also, there are lots of drawbacks to it, and you should make an informed decision or help your friend or loved one make an informed decision about what you want to do when it comes to forensic exams and rape kits. Any of that?
No, I think that covers it.
Great.
Should we move on to the next topic?
Let's do it. We are on the 6th thing you should know about Title IX, and we wanted to talk a little bit about cultural competency. I feel like this is one of those buzzwords like trauma-informed that a lot of people say, but not a lot of people define. So we want to put some words to what we mean when we talk about cultural competency. You want to take that?
I will take a nonviolent stab at it.
Great.
As we like to say here. So why does cultural competency matter in the Title IX process? So cultural competency training is basically a process that allows participants to confront their implicit biases about race, ethnicity, or LGBTQIA relationships, etc. And the idea is that to create a Title IX process or a culture that is equitable for all kinds of survivors, the professionals who are involved in the Title IX process, such as the investigators, analysts, etc., should be trained in this way. Let's see.
And that can mean things like, just to add on to what you so beautifully said, that can mean things like implicit bias training, teaching the people who are involved in assisting students who've experienced sexual violence about everyone's sort of tendency to have biases about individual groups of people. We tend as humans to like and trust people who look like us, and sometimes distrust people who don't, and we have to actively work to confront those biases and talk about them in order to serve survivors of all kinds. So schools that are doing cultural competency training well will provide implicit bias training, will provide training on how to give care and resources to students, as you mentioned, who are LGBTQIA, who are from different racial, ethnic, or cultural backgrounds, and the best ones will take into account different kinds of historical traumas and communal traumas that might exist in various communities and for people of certain backgrounds, so that those who are there to help, who are there to assist people who experience sexual violence, can sometimes have a better understanding of why a certain person may choose one thing over another, or will be able to accurately lay out the pros and cons of pursuing different ways to justice. This is all in service of making sure that we can serve as many survivors of as many different backgrounds and experiences as possible.
And that's something that is especially important considering that the rates of sexual assault for survivors of color, for various individuals in queer relationships are more susceptible to. So that is a problem that administrators need to address on college campuses.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that. That's a really good point, that when we're talking about sexual violence, we know that the populations who experience sexual violence more frequently are populations that are already facing systemic barriers. Queer and trans students, Native students, students of color, particularly Black women. There are many different populations that are experiencing sexual violence at unusually high rates, and having administrators and Title IX coordinators and professors and just caring people at schools who can understand how to best serve those individual folks is the only way that we can continue to move forward in addressing sexual violence. Let's do it. The 7th thing that we should know about Title IX and sexual violence, we're going to talk a little bit about prevention. This is a whole tab on the form that you'll be filling out to add information to our map. And so we thought we might want to talk a little bit about what prevention is and how to help you discern if your school is actually doing it. You want to start by talking to us a little bit about bystander intervention training?
Yes. So bystander intervention training, is basically something that aims to challenge the bystander effect. It's probably something that you've heard about, where if you have a situation where someone is at risk, the more people are present, the less likely it is that someone will step in and try to change things, because everyone is thinking that somebody else will or is responsible for protecting that one person. You might be wondering if your school is instituting bystander intervention training in an effective way. To answer that question, I would suggest just asking yourself or your peers if you feel comfortable. First of all, if you know how to identify a situation where someone is at risk of being sexually assaulted, ask yourself if you know how to step in, how to do it in a way that is safe for you, whether you're comfortable asking other people to help you step in, if that's the best way to do things. And if your answer or your peers' answers to any of those questions is no, then your school is not doing it effectively, I would say.
Yeah.
A lot of schools tend to, if they do it at all, require it for freshmen and then not really ever require students to return and relearn that information, which makes it really easy to forget.
Yeah.
I think students should learn it every year to really learn how to be an effective, active bystander.
Yeah, well said. Absolutely. I think I often hear about it being included in orientation, where you're already getting so much information thrown at you. You're brand new to a school. It might be a little overwhelming, and you may not be able to remember all of that. So even things as simple, all the questions that you just said to ask yourself and your peers were really incredible. I feel like we should write them down somewhere. They're really great. And also, if you don't know what your policy is or where to find it, that's also a sign that your training is not as great as it could be. Because if you don't even know where to find the answers to the things you don't know, then we're a little bit behind the eight ball, so to speak, in understanding what our policies are on our campuses. Another thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about is that there's a question on your form that asks if prevention training is in person or online. And there are some pros and cons to both, but typically at Emory Bond campus, we would prefer for the training to be in person. That is understanding that for some folks, learning online may be easier, and that is definitely something that is important for schools to assess and for individuals to assess for themselves. However, doing it in person is great for a few reasons. There's more accountability. You're in a room with people. You have to see someone talking to you. I know that I've done a few online modules in my life, and they always say things like that. Not really taking the information. There's not a lot of accountability there. Also, a school saying we're going to give you an in-person discussion. We're going to take our time to train you and talk to you about bystander intervention and the school's policy shows the school's dedication to addressing sexual violence. Sort of sets the tone that this is a thing that we talk about here, and also allows people who attend the training to have names and faces of key faculty and staff who may be their allies later on in addressing sexual violence on their campus. Another interesting thing, which is on this list, is talking about sex education. Some schools are starting to hire sex educators who are professionals who are trained to teach about matters relating to sex and sexuality and relationships. And those folks can be a really great asset on campus if your school has one, for some of these cultural competency pieces, and also just knowledge of resources on your school's campus, at your school's community, and outside of it.
Consent education would be a big part of that.
Yeah.
A lot of people, including women, feel like they can't express their desires and concerns in relationships. And a sex educator would be a part of changing that and teaching people how to voice what they want. Yeah.
Absolutely.
We actually have another audience question from someone named Phoebe. Hi, Phoebe. And Phoebe would like to know, when y'all say sexual violence, does this include gender violence? Is the term sexual violence the same as gender violence?
Yeah, that's a great question, and goes a little bit towards the language of Title IX itself, as I was talking about earlier. The language in Title IX says because of sex. And the answer is yes and no. So at Enrique on campus, we understand sexual violence to be very broad and to include all different kinds of gender-based violence, and also conduct that is in all different kinds of settings and from all different kinds of people. The unfortunate truth about sexual violence is that it is not something that just one type of person experiences, and can and often is experienced by many different people, many different genders and backgrounds. And so when we use the term sexual violence, we, I would say, are including all of those kinds of experiences of gender-based violence as well. The law has a maybe slightly different answer. Under the Obama administration, there was some guidance put out in the form of letters. They're called the Dear Colleague letters. You may have heard about them. And this was when the Department of Education said, we're going to give schools some background, some information, some tools to help make sure that they're implementing Title IX in the way that we want them to do it. And this is the way that Title IX implementation has worked since the first Bush administration in the early 90s. Administrations would sort of informally give guidance, and schools would not be bound to follow that guidance. It's not a legally binding thing, but often would, because they see the Department of Education as experts and would often say, okay, great, the department wants us to do this, we're going to do it. And under the Obama administration, there was a Dear Colleague letter that addressed violence that students may experience because of their gender identity or their gender presentation. Meaning like the way that they talk about their own gender or the way that they dress, act, or kind of exist in the world. That guidance was sort of controversial, and some schools did not want to implement it, and has since been repealed. So when the president appointed Betsy to the Department of Education, she said, no, you no longer have to do that. So the status of protection for gender-based violence is sort of up in the air. Schools can certainly opt into putting that in their policies. There's nothing right now that says they can't, but also they don't have to, and it's a little bit unclear if the law will enforce that or not. So it's a confusing answer to a question that is really important, but it's not really black and white. It's a little bit difficult to answer. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Phoebe.
We have just a couple of points left, 2 more things to talk about in just a few minutes, so we're going to try to race through them. We can revisit them if you have more questions. The 8th thing you should know is about the terms that we're using, survivor or victim. We hear often people asking, should I use the term survivor or should I use victim? And I'll say that human beings are different and have varied experiences and use different words to describe their own experiences. Here at Enrique on campus, we use the term survivor first, but if an individual person were to identify themselves as a victim, we would follow whatever they do and call them whatever they call themselves. This is sort of a best practice for all of life. If someone asks you to call them a name that you have never heard before, or asks you to give them a pronoun that you've never used for them before, do it. It's really great, it's super easy. And we feel the same way about other identities like race, ethnic backgrounds, and like survivor or victim status, that a person should be able to determine for themselves how they want to identify. But we do use the term survivor first because it is often seen as being a little bit more empowering and a little bit less labeling of a specific experience. But by all means, if a person chose a different term, we would follow suit. Another quick note, as earlier I was talking about cultural competency, it's sort of one of these terms we throw around. Another one that we throw around a lot is trauma-informed. I'm wondering if you want to give us a little bit of information about what trauma-informed means.
Yeah, so a trauma-informed practice basically recognizes the trauma that a survivor has undergone and implements that awareness by asking the survivor for permission to do things, offering them control over their own journey after their assault, and providing them with support so that they're not re-traumatized. Do you mind talking a little bit about what institutional betrayal is?
Sure. Yeah, so at Enrique on campus, we always talk about our work being trauma-informed and survivor-centered, and Betsy beautifully explained what trauma-informed means. And something that can occur that you were alluding to just now, sometimes with survivors, is that you experience some kind of harm, You do what you are supposed to do, what your policy says, what the law says to address that harm, and you expect your school to help you, to back you up, to do what they said they're going to do, and instead they don't. And this is something that we refer to as institutional harm. This can also happen when survivors choose to report to the police and they're not taken seriously and sometimes criminalized for reporting. This is the experience that happens when the thing that you thought was supposed to help you and protect you, in fact, does not. And it's sort of an extra layer of betrayal that you have already worked really hard to do your own work and your own healing and pursue the means of justice that you chose. And then when you do that, you're met with an unexpected outcome that betrays your trust in that particular institution. Really quickly, I also want to talk about survivor-centered, which is basically what it sounds. Making sure that when we're talking about sexual violence, we are talking directly from a survivor experience. So for organizations like EROC on campus, that means that we have student activists and survivors as part of our staff who are involved in doing this work every day. But also it means that we work really hard to make sure we're forming relationships with survivors, with current students, with people who are experiencing this in real time and listening very carefully to them about what it is that they want and using our platform to advocate for them. This is a best practice in any kind of organizing, and it's also a best practice in the movement to end sexual violence, that when we're talking about survivors, we should have survivors in the room, and we should have people who can talk about their own experience, and more than one, because it turns out that not every survivor thinks the same thing, or has the same experience, or wants the same outcome. So being survivor-centered means always making sure we're getting voices of the most affected people in the room and being thoughtful about what those people look like, where they came from, what their experiences are, what identities they hold, in an effort to get as many voices at the table as possible.
Hashtag representation.
I'll talk really briefly about consent. This is the 9th thing to know about Title IX. That consent is a piece of the conversation. We at EROC often talk about affirmative consent, which you may have also heard in lots of other places. Do you want to talk a little bit about affirmative consent?
Yeah, so affirmative consent is sort of a different framework from like the no means no model that some people use. And it basically requires each party who is engaging in sexual activity or is about to pay attention to what they want and to what the other person wants, and making sure that consent is affirmative, conscious, voluntary, ongoing.
Yeah.
Any other words that we should?
No, that's perfect. Consent is something that needs to be freely given, that can't be coerced.
Yeah.
It can be revoked at any time. So if you say, hell yes, I want to do this, and then 5 minutes later you change your mind, totally okay. And any partner that you're engaging in sexual activity with should respect that. It needs to be enthusiastic. So not like, oh yes, I suppose, but like a yeah, for sure. I think you said it really beautifully, that consent is sort of like changing, ongoing agreement, and it's not just a one-time experience. There's some questions about consent on the form and about how your school defines consent, and there are 5 points to consent, most of which we just covered, that EROC uses in our sort of best definition of consent. So look out for those when you're filling out the form. All right, that does it for 9 things to know about Title IX. There's so much more to come. Keep working on the map, bump that amazing playlist if you've got it, and shoot us some questions. You can DM us on Twitter, you can DM us on Instagram, you can email us at matt@ngreatoncampus.org, you can comment on the Facebook video, you can put it in an anonymous Google form that hopefully is linked somewhere. If not, it's in your email, it's in the comments, I'm seeing a thumbs up. There's so many ways to get in touch with us. We're here for you. We're here to make this experience as easy as possible, so be sure to get in touch with us if you need anything. We are here to answer some questions that you may have about filling out the form and putting your school's information on the map. Before we do that, I wanted to make sure to encourage you, if you're filling out a form or if you're watching the video, to stretch. Hopefully you took a little walk while we were on break. If you get frustrated or overwhelmed by any part of this, like, take care of yourself. There should be there are some great resources in the email that you got about filling out the form. Anytime you can, go outside, breathe, stretch, pet an animal, have a snack, watch a show on Netflix, whatever it is you need to do, make sure that you're taking care of yourself. One of my favorite methods of self-care is music. I love listening to all kinds of music, and I love making a weirdly specific playlist. Turns out that's a thing that we share, and I wanted to know if you wanted to talk just a tiny bit about your favorite playlist and solicit some user favorite songs.
Ooh, so one of my favorite playlists on Spotify currently is Pollen.
Yeah.
Which is a great playlist. All genres.
Yeah, it's super fun.
Yeah, it is. It's like low-key hype and then sometimes high-key hype at the same time. Anti-pop is another one with a similar vibe. If you want more music like that. Latin cardio is great for a workout.
Oh, all right, you're a real connoisseur. Can you talk a little bit about this playlist that you constructed for today?
Yes. So we went with locations. Some songs are about maps, like the Dora Explorer song.
Sure, gotta have it.
Yeah,
essential.
part of my childhood. Yeah, we also have some, I don't know, we have some, I guess, like cool singers. People really like Khalid. I love Khalid.
Great.
I put a K-pop song on there that's like classic K-pop,
Gotta
not
have it.
BTS, because I'm like, you know.
Oh, controversial. Okay.
Let's see. Yeah, we have some songs in Spanish. I tried to be international, try to be diverse. There's so much great music out there from so many different parts of the world.
So, if you are with us, if you're listening to the playlist, or if you just have a lot of opinions about songs and there's a song that you have in mind about a specific location or about maps that you think could be a good addition to our EROC Map Day playlist, let us know. Comment or tweet at us or email us, and we'll make sure we add it to the playlist so that you can bump those tunes while you are filling out the map. Okay, let's talk about questions. Some questions that you might have that you might run across while you are filling out the form. The first question I have here is, if rape is considered a crime, why don't survivors just report their assault to the police? Do you want to take that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that I had before taking my class on sexual assault last year, and you know, even after I came to EROC, it was helpful to hear that answer again. So rape is a criminal offense that is, depending on the state, punishable by X number of years in prison. But it is also a violation of Title IX. I think that is something that was established by some Supreme Court cases that I think everyone knows about. That is Title IX, as we explained before, it's a federal law that discriminates, that prevents sex discrimination, and sexual harassment is a form of that. That is why rape is something that people, often choose to report to their school, because it's a Title IX violation.
Absolutely. Also, it's a good time to acknowledge that there are many different reasons why an individual, especially people who are members of communities that face systemic barriers, may not want to report to the police. We know that particularly for Black and brown communities, for poorer communities, and for immigrant communities, Native communities, there's a lot of communities that have been treated very poorly by police. And there are reasons why folks who maybe present in a certain way, gender-wise, or have a different background, might not feel comfortable ever reporting any kind of crime to the police. And the good thing about Title IX is because it's a civil rights law, it's available to any person and is a different way to address rape and other kinds of sexual violence. Also, we talked a little bit about rape kits in the last hour, but we also should talk a little bit about police. They're often not trained on how to really assist a survivor of sexual violence. Some are, but it's a real sort of mixed bag. So a person may disclose to police, and then the police officer might not have the tools and training necessary to really support that person in the most survivor-centered, trauma-informed way possible. That might also be true on a campus, but there's a hope that there's different kinds of support in both of those ways of going, and in other ways that folks might seek support after experiencing sexual violence that exists outside of the police and the legal system, the criminal justice system. All right, does every school, I feel like we covered this a little bit, but let's talk about it directly. Does every school interpret Title IX the same way? It's a law. Isn't there just one way to do it?
No, sorry.
This is why your work as volunteers is so important to us, because every school implements Title IX in a different way. There's a great deal of variation when it comes to the definition of sexual assault, definition of consent. Some schools have it, some schools don't. Every school defines it differently. Are there any other things that schools might do? Oh, the investigation process, the adjudication process would be another thing.
Any sanctions, any ways that people who are found responsible for harming others might be asked to rectify that harm. Can also be different. And we talked about this a little bit last hour when we were talking about Title IX coordinators, but schools are very different. Schools are in different parts of the country, they serve different populations. Some of them are state funded, some of them are community colleges, some of them are privately funded. There are differences in resources, and that can also affect how schools implement Title IX. Something that's not here, but I will mention briefly, is also that there are some institutions that have religious exemptions under Title IX, meaning that if a school has some closely held religious belief that is in conflict with parts of Title IX, they may be able to actually not implement that specific part of Title IX. So even though Title IX is a law that is supposed to be followed, and there's lots of guidance about how to do it, and there is an upcoming potential change in the law for how Title IX will even be implemented at all, there's a wide variety of differences in all kinds of schools and all kinds of places and how Title IX is interpreted and implemented. All right, the next question is a heavy hitter. I'm going to try my best to answer it. The next question I have is, what is due process and why is it such a controversial term? Due process is a term you may hear quite a bit when talking about sexual violence and talking about Title IX. There are many concerns about due process for all parties involved in a Title IX complaint and reporting process. Due process literally means the process due. What does an institution owe you before they can have you do something? Due process is used commonly in the criminal justice system and the legal system in general, but it's easiest to illustrate the criminal justice system that when someone is accused of committing a crime, the process that's due to them is an investigation and potentially a trial, or the ability to opt into or out of a trial by their peers. There are lots of things to say about how the criminal justice system works. We know that this is like a sort of reductive best case scenario, but that's one way that due process operates, that before we decide that we're going to put someone in incarceration, we feel we need to make sure that we are giving them a chance to have their day in court, so to speak. That's not always how it works, but that's the idea. Same thing in Title IX. So there are some concerns that people who are the named harassers, the people who are accused of perpetrating harm on campus, are not getting the process that they need before they are being punished or in some other way called out for having caused that kind of harm. So due process really just requires the named harasser to have fair treatment during the investigation, to make sure that there are investigators who are collecting all the data possible. It's important to note that Title IX is a civil rights proceeding, which means that the standard, the sort of level that you use to decide if someone is responsible for causing harm is lower than it is in the criminal justice system. So in the criminal justice system, if you watched a lot of Law and Order like I have, you may be familiar with beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the standard, that's the name for it, that we use in criminal law to say, okay, we're not going to punish someone with any sort of jail time or state supervision unless we're sure beyond a reasonable doubt that they may have committed this crime. Again, best case scenario, not always how it works. But in Title IX, the standard that we recommend, and the standard that is a civil rights standard, is preponderance of the evidence. This basically means that any person who's doing an investigation or making a decision about harm on campus needs to decide if it is more likely than not that the person who is named as a harasser committed that particular behavior, that displayed that particular conduct. So this process is used in all sorts of civil rights processes. It's used in housing discrimination, it's used in employment discrimination, which are also civil rights protections. But also it's used in all sorts of civil law. So as I often say, if your neighbor's tree limb falls on your parked car, the standard that we use to figure out if they need to pay you for that car is exactly the same as this. Is it more likely than not that something that your neighbor did, like not taking care of their tree correctly, led to that tree harming your property? If it's more likely than not that they were sort of neglectful and didn't take care of the tree and that's why the limb fell, then they have to pay you for the damage that was done to your car. Same idea. If it's more likely than not that someone caused harm in this way that the survivor is alleging, then something should happen. That something is a wide variety of things. They're often referred to as sanctions. They're often put together in one bucket, but that can include like taking a substance abuse class. That can include like getting mentoring or counseling or some other sort of support. That can include writing a reflection paper or doing some learning about why the behavior that they exhibited was harmful or bad. It can also include suspension or expulsion, and sometimes does. But the process that's due to a named harasser under the civil rights law really should be the same as other civil rights law. It should be the preponderance of the evidence. Hopefully that made sense to you. It got a little in the weeds. Feel free to ask questions if you're confused. Go ahead.
I have a follow-up question.
Yeah,
actually, Ever. But before that, I just want to do another audience shout out. Thank you to Rosangela for sharing our live stream. And
Awesome.
we encourage you to keep doing that, keep sharing.
Thank you.
Back to due process.
Yeah.
I was wondering if it's possible for a Title IX process to include trauma-informed practices that respect and appreciate the trauma that the survivor has gone through, and also respect due process at the same time. They
Yeah.
seem really contrary. How does that work?
It's a really good question, and it's something that we're speaking about a lot right now in this field for a few reasons. So without getting too much into the weeds, I've mentioned a little bit that the current administration, the presidential administration, is in the Department of Education, is working to change what the actual text of the Title IX law says. That hasn't happened in a long time. It's often been done through informal guidance. This administration has decided they want to do it formally through this process. That means that they have to write a proposed change. They have to tell the public what that proposed change is. They have to give the public some time to get feedback on that change. And then they have to consider some of that feedback, read sources that they didn't have before, take in comments that they haven't heard before, and then come out with a final version of their changes. And once the final version comes out, 30 days later, that final version will be the law, and that will be what every school has to follow, and will be written right into the statute, into the text of the law, which has not happened in a very long time. In that process has been happening over the past year and change. The proposed rule came out last November. You might have heard something about that. You may hear about it referred to as the proposed rule, as the NPRM, which is the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. It's the actual slip of paper that the Department of Education has to submit to say, we're changing the rule. You may hear about it as just the changes to Title IX. That happened in November. We had some time to give feedback. NREAP on campus and our friends over at Know Your Nine partnered with lots of other different organizations in the movement to try to get the word out about adding your voice to the feedback on the rule. That period ended in the end of January, and now the Department of Education is taking all those comments, looking at them, deciding which comments have so much material in them that they haven't seen before that they need to actually read and engage with and take in that information, and deciding which comments they're just going to look at and say, like, thanks for your opinion, but you haven't told us anything new here. So they're doing that right now. There's not a ton of accountability for how that's done. There's a complex set of rules and regulations that governs that process that is a little confusing to even lawyers who do this for a living, so I will not get into it. Feel free to ask a follow-up question if you have it. But all that to say that in this conversation about how the law is going to change and how Title IX is going to change, we're talking a lot about due process, particularly for respondents. And I want to reframe that question to ask about what a fair process looks like. Civil rights laws exist to provide equitable and fair processes for everyone. The point of Title IX is to provide equitable access to education. And equitable is an important word to use as opposed to equal, because equitable understands that it might not look the same for every person, and that is actually okay. That we need to be working to make sure that every person has what they need to access education, not that every person has the same thing to access education. So what we should be asking instead of is due process happening for named harassers, we should be asking, is this a fair and equitable process for everyone? And trauma-informed care and survivor-centered processes are a big piece of equitable practice. That when we're thinking about who is involved in this process, the named harasser, the complainant, the survivor, all of the faculty and staff at schools that are involved in these hearings, the investigators, the Title IX coordinators, all of those people should be working to make sure that we are creating an equitable environment for everyone to get the best education possible, to get the best access to education possible. So due process does not actually conflict with survivor-centered work or trauma-informed work, because trauma-informed care simply means being cognizant, that being aware that people have experienced harm, and that goes for everyone. I often say trauma-informed care is not just for survivors, it's for everyone involved in the process, that we should be asking questions in a way that is thoughtful for everyone, that we should be providing resources that can help support everyone involved in this process to come to a fair and equitable resolution for every single person. And so that is my little speech about due process and trauma-informed care. If you have more questions, please ask them, because there's a lot to say there. What else do we have to talk about here? There are so many questions that we could ask. Let's talk, while we're in this due process area, let's talk about false accusations. So something you might hear a lot is, what about false accusations? What about people who are accused of sexual violence and didn't actually commit it? And I'm here to say that that does occasionally happen. That happens no more frequently in sexual violence and in Title IX than it does in any other law. So there are people all the time who are falsely accused of theft or of robbery. That actually exists because the legal system is imperfect and laws are imperfect. However, it's really not all that common. You're more likely to be struck by lightning than falsely accused of sexual assault. It's a really, really low opportunity. It's a really low chance that that will happen to you. And also, something that is really important to remember is that, especially for men, but for all people, men are more likely to be assaulted than falsely accused of sexual assault. So I would encourage folks who are worried about false accusations to also be worried about all of the people who may have experienced sexual violence, who are not getting the support they need because they don't feel like there's a space for them in the conversation. And remember that it's not just women or people who look like women who experience sexual violence, but it's something that people of all genders experience. So I'll also talk a little bit about truth-telling and believing survivors. Again, under this sort of due process, false accusations headline, we sometimes talk about, how do you know a survivor is telling the truth? And the answer to that is that we never necessarily know that anyone is telling the truth, but we do know that individual people are the best representatives of their own experience. That we should believe survivors, that we should take what they say as real and true because they're representing an experience that they had. And we should trust that there are processes in place to help support both survivors and named harassers, and advocate for those processes to be as good, as equitable as possible, so that even if there is some degree of misunderstanding or some degree of conflict about what actually happened, that everyone in that process is being cared for, being supported, and getting what they need to make sure that whatever happened that was bad and harmful doesn't happen again, regardless of what is true. Because truth is, we're like the representatives of our own experience.
Yes.
We should be able to say, this is what happened, and get the support and trust and belief that we all deserve, no matter what it is.
I have a question, Ever, about a term that we've been using for the past hour and a half.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
Named harasser.
Yeah.
Why is it that we use that term? What does it mean? Can you talk about
That's a great question. We
Yeah.
probably should have covered that earlier. Let's cover it now. So in the Title IX process, you may hear the term complainant and respondent. That is the sort of legal terms that we use for people in this process. The complainant is the person who makes a complaint. The respondent is the person who responds to that complaint. Sometimes you'll hear them referred to as complainant and accused. We at Enrique on campus prefer the term named harasser because it states that this person has been said by someone to have harassed them, and puts them in a position of needing care and support and time to be held responsible for whatever behavior they perpetrated. We also sometimes hear perpetrator, but we feel as if named harasser gives weight and merit to what that person did and what process they should be accountable to, without framing it as that person being inherently bad or being at fault from the get-go. We know that all kinds of harm happen for all kinds of different reasons, and while harm, sexual violence, is always is not what we want to happen and is always harmful, that the people who are named deserve to get the support and the resources that they need to not perpetrate that kind of harm again. That may be removal from a community, but it may not. And so keeping named harasser as the term that we use keeps it a little bit more neutral and keeps them in conversation and in a position of being held accountable for their behavior without alienating them by calling them perpetrators or accused, trying to keep everyone in the conversation to do what we can to help eliminate the culture that allows for sexual violence.
Awesome, thank you. That's something that I've been wondering a lot.
Yeah, it's something we talk about really frequently,
Yeah.
and I think a lot of people are wondering about, and it is subject to change. Language is always subject to change.
Yes.
We're always working to find the best words.
Yes.
Okay, more questions. What else do we have?
We have survivor-specific questions and then questions about the map as well.
All right, let's talk about a few of the survivor-specific questions.
Okay.
What do you got?
So speaking from the point of view of a student,
Sure.
What should I expect from a Title IX coordinator?
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit earlier when we were talking about what Title IX coordinators do. You should expect your Title IX coordinator to take a complaint if you have it. Also, if you do not want to formally complain, your Title IX coordinator should be able to give you a comprehensive rundown of your rights under Title IX, what the civil rights law guarantees you on campus at your school, and also give you an understanding of what options you have next, whether it is filing a formal complaint or accessing something that we call supportive measures, which are things like a change in room assignment, a change in class schedule, a change in gym hours, things that allow the person who experienced harm to not have to see the person who harmed them. Those are non-punitive, and those are available to anyone under Title IX, and does not require a formal complaint. So a Title IX coordinator should be able to give you all that information, tell you what your policy says, help you figure out if what you experienced falls under Title IX in a way that would allow you to report that behavior, help you decide if you want to report that behavior to the school or potentially to the police if it's criminal, and also help hook you up with everything that you need to feel supported as you're trying to heal from this experience. And that can also include helping to email professors and teachers about class time you may be missing, helping to hook up survivors with mental health resources that they need, any variety of things that someone might need to heal, and to do work to be able to once again access their education. So Title IX coordinators should have a real good handle on all of that, sort of a guide to give you the universe of options and help you through the process.
Awesome. So the next question is, from the point of view of a survivor who may not know who raped them.
Yeah.
So the question is, what if I don't know the person who raped me and something could happen at a party? Colleges, it's a big community with a lot of people.
Yeah.
What do you do if you don't know the person?
Yeah, for sure. The Title IX coordinator on your campus can still be an amazing resource and support for you in that moment, and also other folks on campus as well, and you can still access supportive measures. So if you're unable to identify the person who caused you harm, you can still report to your school and say, this thing happened, and I need some support. And you can still access mental health services, you can still access potentially a forensic exam if you'd like it, or if that's something that applies to your situation. You can still access changes to your class schedule, changes to your living arrangement. It may not be to avoid a particular person, but it may be to just help you be more comfortable while you are trying to heal from the experience that you had. There are many resources that you can still access on campus, even if you cannot identify the person who harmed you.
And on the topic of accessing resources, students don't always know where to go. We know that there's this thing called confidentiality and that there are some people on our campus who are and some people who aren't.
Yeah.
So how do you figure that out?
That's a really important distinction, and the unfortunate answer is it's sometimes not clear. There are some schools who do a really great job of naming who on the campus or at the school is confidential, meaning that if you go to them and say that you've experienced some kind of harm, whether it's criminal, Title IX or not, they don't have to tell anyone else, that they can just be there and support you, and they don't have to report that to the school. Some schools will, if you Google your school name and add confidential resources or confidential informant or confidential reporting, you can sometimes find that information. I've seen some schools put it right in their policies. I've seen some schools have like a little grid where it says the kind of person, like is my professor confidential? Is my RA confidential? Is my mental health provider confidential? And it kind of has a grid that explains all those options to you. Frequently, members of the faculty or staff are not actually confidential people to report to. Because schools can get in legal and financial trouble for not following Title IX, they get a little nervous about maybe not knowing about some kind of harm that has occurred on their campus. So to try to fix that, many schools have a policy that makes some faculty or staff mandated reporters, different than mandatory reporters. It's not a legal obligation from the government or the state, but from the school, which basically says, hey professor, if a student comes to you and says that they experienced sexual violence, you have to tell the Title IX office, because we need to be able to make sure that we are attending to their rights and that we are providing resources and that we are using the civil rights standard to address equitable access to education. Because if schools are found to have not done that well or correctly, then they can be held responsible by the federal government or sometimes by a private lawsuit or many other ways. So that has created a situation where sometimes faculty and staff are people who have to tell the Title IX coordinator or the Title IX office if they hear about instances of sexual violence at their schools. That information should be in your policy, and if it's not, ask around to figure out who is confidential and who's not. So those people may not be confidential, but people who are mental health professionals. There's something that you might have heard about, which is a patient provider confidentiality, doctor-patient confidentiality, it's sometimes referred to as. And this means that if you're seeing a therapist, if you're seeing a crisis counselor, they, by law, cannot actually tell other people about what you tell them, and they're just there to be a resource for you and to support you in that process. If you're not sure if someone's confidential, it's important to ask around, do some Googling, because you may end up in a situation where you tell someone thinking that it's confidential and it's not, and if you're not trying to have your experience reported to the school, then that can put people in a really tricky situation. So if you have the ability and the time and the resources and the support to figure that out before reporting to someone and disclosing to someone, that's recommended.
So we have a viewer question about what we were talking about before with being trauma-informed and named harassers. Thank you for following through. It's a difficult subject, and we welcome questions here. So the question is, how does trauma-informed care create an equitable solution for named harassers?
That's a great question. I think that it's important to remember that everyone involved in a Title IX process is experiencing a lot of stress and is experiencing a really difficult situation. It's not easy, it's not simple, and it's hard to go through. So making sure that when we are asking questions of any party involved, that we are doing it in a way that gives them time to reflect, that doesn't force them to give answers right away, that allows them to think through how to represent their own experience, can be helpful for every person involved. Because you've all seen, I'm sure, shows like SVU, where lawyers are grilling people on the stand and the witness breaks down and they confess something. It's a really traumatic experience, and that's something that Title IX does not at all require. We're not looking to replicate a really intense courtroom scenario. We're looking to make sure that we get all the information possible to provide support to the survivor and also to the named harasser, to avoid further instances of sexual violence and unsafe experiences on school campuses and in school communities. So making sure that we are doing as much good as possible, that we're caring as much for everyone involved, can keep them in the conversation, can make sure that the accountability measures work best when people feel like they're not alienated. This goes back to that named harasser thing as well. When people don't feel alienated or villainized in the process, it can often help administrators keep those people in the process, and trauma-informed care is one way to do that, to make sure that people are not feeling alienated and accused and harmed by the whole process. That's not for the survivor to hold. The survivor is just there to heal and to tell their story, but the administration, the faculty, the staff, the Title IX coordinators can all use trauma-informed care to make sure that everyone in the process is being cared for as well as possible. I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, feel free to ask a follow-up.
All right.
We're running a little bit low on time. We just got about 10 minutes left, so I want to skip ahead to some of the questions about the map and the form that you're filling out. So you're sort of our map aficionado at the moment. So I'm going to ask you some of these questions. So there's a lot of questions and text boxes in this form. There's a lot of stuff that we're hoping that students will help us figure out and allies help us figure out. What if I'm filling out the form and I can't find something? Should I ask my school? What should I do?
So that's a great question. The map is supposed to exist to collect information that is currently accessible to students and members of the general public. So you shouldn't really reach out to your school to have to find a piece of information, because we're trying to collect what they can get available to us currently. And if we put the school on the map and it says that, you know, there's no information about this particular part of the policy, that's something that the school can work on and fix.
That makes sense. So when I'm researching all of these things, am I trying to find out like how a school has dealt with Title IX? Am I trying to find out some history about them? Or am I Googling like their policy? What am I looking for?
Yeah, so mainly you're looking at the policy. There is a part that asks you to look up the school's clery statistics, which does deal with how they've dealt with you know, criminal offenses in the past. That does, you know, refer to the school's history. But most of the work you're doing is about the policy. You're not doing work to check whether the school has, you know, kept its word. You're just putting down the promises, so to speak, for the map.
That makes sense. Okay. So we talked a little bit about sanctions, which are ways that named harassers might be held responsible to be an accountability process for the harm that they've caused someone else. I'm wondering about where I might find information about if that has happened and what the sanctions are. Is there an official way that schools have to report what happened to the people who were named harassers?
Yeah, so sadly there isn't. Some schools will release annual Title IX sexual harassment reports, and you might be able to find sanctions data in there. It's worth Googling that to take a look.
Question on here about making materials that train students and that inform students of their rights accessible, and I wanted to address that a little bit. So there's a question asking if training materials are made accessible to students with visual impairments or students with print-based disabilities, and I wanted to give an example of what that could look like, just in case you are coming across that question and wondering what the heck we're asking you. So sometimes on an individual web page, if you go onto a web page, it will say somewhere that the page is compatible with screen readers. The screen reader being something that you can have a plugin on your computer or a program on your computer to read out a page to you. So if you're unable to read the text on a page, you can have it read out loud to you. So having a page compatible with screen readers is one very easy way to make this information accessible. Using a speech function, so a lot of times computers and laptops allow a user to talk to it to type. That's another way, if you have forms on your websites or your school's website, to allow it to be compatible with a speech function can be really helpful for folks who are unable to type. Making sure that you have fonts that are easy to read. Some examples are Lucida Sans, like something that's like a really straight Tahoma, Georgia, fonts that are really clear, that have really letters that don't bleed into each other too much, that aren't too like curly or flowy, or those are easier to read and can often be made larger as well. So that's another way to make material really accessible, is to make sure it's in a really kind of straightforward, easy to read font that can then be made bigger for those who need text to be bigger to read it. And the last thing I'm going to say is changing colors. So sometimes the contrast of colors can be difficult for people with certain kinds of visual impairments. So making sure that the colors have really good contrast. There are some best practices on this. Do a Google Ask a Friend. But also providing resources that maybe have a couple of different color schemes, so that if someone has a red-green deficiency, they can still see the differences in colors if they use another color palette. So those are all ways that materials can be made more accessible for people with visual impairments.
We have one last audience question
Okay,
that is
let's do it.
perfect for closing out the second hour. They would like to know, how do I get involved with the MAP or volunteer with EROC?
What a great question. So if you are interested in adding information to the map and you haven't yet been given an email with information on how to do that, you can do all sorts of things to get our attention. You could tweet at us. You could DM us on Instagram or Twitter. You could comment on this Facebook video. You could send us an email at map@nrapeoncampus.org. What we need from you is your name, an email address, and the school that you want to fill out information for. This is also an important time to note that you can fill out data for your school, but also if you're really interested in continuing to do this work, you can fill out data for other schools. It doesn't have to be a school you attend. There are definitely some advantages to knowing sort of the ins and outs of things for a school you attend, but schools have policies, as you said so beautifully. We're looking to see what schools have publicly available to people. So even if you don't go to a school, you should be able to find that information and input what is available to the general public into a form. Welcome back to our last little bit of programming for our MAP day. You may notice that I have been joined by someone who is not Betsy. So once again, I'm Hanna, and I'm the Campus Policy Manager here at NRAPE on Campus.
Hi, my name is Kimberly Barboza. I am the State Policy Fellow here at NRAPE on Campus.
And also, I invited Kimberly for this conversation because you have just graduated and did amazing work on your campus at your school when you were there, and are also so great at talking about what's next for our movement, what we should be doing. And I wanted to get a perspective of someone who is a little closer to school than some of us are. So I'm really looking forward to talking a little bit with you about what is next and what accountability and Title IX reform can look like in the future.
Absolutely, thanks for having me. I feel like this map was born out of the notion, the sentiment of what do I wish, what do we as a survivor-led organization wish we had on our campuses, right? And so when I first came across the accountability map, I was towards the end of my college career, and I was like, wow, had only I had seen something about this, had only I looked at something like this earlier, had only this existed maybe when I was doing my college search. Because I don't think, the accountability map should be used as a deterrent from going to a school if that's, you still really want to go to that school. But the understanding that you can love an institution and you can really believe in its ability to get better and be better is something that I think drives a lot of student activists, right? Because there's a lot of pain and a lot of emotions and a lot of stuff going on, but there is a underlying feeling of so much love and so much want to do better, and a little bit of optimism amongst all kind of the craziness and the sadness of it.
Yeah, I'm really glad you say that, because this is a complicated feeling that we talk about. We were just having this conversation yesterday. I heard you talking about it. It's so hard sometimes when we talked a little bit earlier today about institutional betrayal, the experience of wanting your school to do the right thing and to address things in a way that's survivor-centered and trauma-informed and compliant with the law, and how that doesn't always happen. But I think it's a real thing that you named, that you can still love the things that don't always love you back the way you want to. And what does it mean to push for change at your school, knowing that you might not see the fruits of that labor, but that someone coming behind you may have a better experience than you did. And I'm hoping that that's something that this map can be used for. And also just want to validate for any of you who are feeling that feeling of oh man, my school is doing so many harmful things, but also I really love being here. Like, yes, that is really common and is really difficult to integrate, and that's okay.
Yeah, I think I feel like student leaders, particularly, I know that the folks who have been involved in Map Day thus far, and we thank you so much for all the work that you put into helping us build this tool. I have the sense that those students are likely involved on their campuses.
Probably, yeah.
I know, I was working in the admissions office at this, and telling students to come to my institution, and telling students, how much I loved the sense of community that my school was building, and all the fun and all the opportunities I had, and then at the same time, would go off to my meetings with administration and read the riot act for everything that I felt that they were doing incorrectly, and the way that they were causing harm to survivors. So it is this, you feel this conflict, and you feel pulled in many different directions as a student leader, and so I think honoring those feelings
absolutely
and allowing yourself to exist in that conflict and that ambiguity is definitely important.
For sure. It's something that we also talk about a lot when talking about different ways to create change, that some of the work that we do here at Enrico on campus is sort of within systems that already exist. We're trying to get better state laws, better federal laws, better campus policies, better school policies. But there's also a really important role for the people who are not going to do that, who are not going to try to make change from the inside, and who are instead going to put outside pressure. The activists, the people who are staging demonstrations, who are putting their school on blast for the things that they've done poorly. And sometimes the people can be both inside and outside, but it's important. I always want to highlight the role of working within the system, but also empowering folks to work outside of it and do whatever they need to do to sort of say their piece and try to hold their school accountable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Okay, so let's talk. I could talk to you about this forever.
Yeah.
Let's talk about, this is something that I think you're gonna have something beautiful to say about this in your experience, and I can also offer mine. What would you say to people who are filling out this form, or who are hearing about this, who are really upset or disappointed, or otherwise not thrilled with what they found? What should students do? What would they be feeling, and what can we do about it?
A lot of, I think we referenced conflict, but I think it's also in those emotions, allow yourself to feel those things, 100%, but then also to view them as an opportunity to make change and to do better. And I think oftentimes students, young people, we like to complain. And I think that is cathartic and that is important, but especially when you're bringing this issue to other people, and when you're bringing this issue to people who may not fully understand the ways that your institution is causing harm to survivors, if you frame it in a way of see this as an opportunity for us to work together and make new connections, build relationships, improve the quality and the health of your community. I think there is a palpable feeling around campuses when things go right, when we're celebrating something, right? I think the feeling of when your school wins an athletic conference, or when there's a big event or a concert, that can also transfer into when people are doing good by one another. I've been to school, I know of schools that do big service days, for example, and there's always a really lighthearted feeling on campus, even if those students have been doing a service day in places where people are facing harm, right? So you framing it as an opportunity, framing it as something positive, looking at the potential instead of just kind of wallowing in the depressing aspects of what harm has been caused,
Yeah.
But I don't know if that...
No, I think we wanted to acknowledge, and you already did a beautiful job of doing this, that this might be sort of dismal. This might not be ideal, and that there is room to feel that, and also that there is so much opportunity. And one of the things, we talked a little bit about this in the previous couple of hours, but one of the things that's so great about this map is that if and when it's sort of launched in its full way, the more schools we get on it, the more information we have, the more students can start really looking at what their school has, what other schools have, coming up with ideas, for things to push their schools on. And we're working really hard, you especially are working really hard on creating materials and resources for those students to have the support they need to make changes on campus. So if you feel discouraged, that's okay. Take some time to take care of yourself, to acknowledge that feeling, but then also, you said so beautifully, like, use it as a moment, use it as an opportunity to think about what the future could be. We always have to have an eye towards what we're building for, so we don't get lost in the everyday sort of mire and work of fighting.
Absolutely, I think that's definitely a value that we try to embody here. I've heard it said many times, we're not ending rape on campus tomorrow, but going in with that ideal, pushing for that ideal, like, what is your radical, idealized world without sexual violence, right? Like, what does that look like to you? Going in with the intention of fighting for that and understanding that it may not happen tomorrow and that you may have to navigate some difficult situations along the way. But there is so much worth and positivity into attacking, into going after what you want in that way. Being like, yes, it is possible. It absolutely is possible. It's difficult, it is emotional, but it absolutely is possible. And so, like, carrying that, I feel like, is something that we do here.
Yeah.
So well said. Thanks.
That's actually a really great pivot into talking. I alluded a little bit to this. I gave a quick rundown, into talking a little bit about how the new regulations will work, and about the changes to Title IX. So you may have heard a little bit about this. I spoke about it briefly. This administration is going through a formal process to change the law, and to change some of the ways that schools use Title IX on their campuses. And some of the things that we saw in the proposed rule, in the sort of draft, were not so great. There's some language in there that may prevent schools from investigating conduct that happens off campus. So in off-campus housing and off-campus places where students hang out, we know that there are things that occur there that are harmful, and that a school being able to help support a student who's experienced crime in those settings is ideal. But that may be changing. Also trying to set a new definition that everyone will have to use for sexual harassment that doesn't include a whole lot of things that we would see as sexual violence and sexual harassment. We didn't talk about this, so I'm curious to see what you have to say about this. But we have this map. We're asking for all of these school policies. Is this useless if it's all about to change? Like, what do we do? I just started understanding Title IX. I'll throw this out. And now you're telling me it's going to change. What happens now?
I think we did talk about this at one point. I think I said something about how my fellowship has really made me realize just how new the world of Title IX policy is. I believe I used the word craziness to refer to this before, and I apologize, that is a very ableist term. I would rather use the term ambiguous and confusing, navigating this world of Title IX policy and how to interpret a short line of several words that doesn't really say much and has been fought over the meaning of specific words in the title in courts. And so I don't think it's useless if the regulations are going to change, because what we should be working towards are policies that outlast presidential administrations, right? Policies that, once we start establishing this is a difficult question.
It is.
Once we start, I think, establishing more and more, that our interpretation of Title IX should be, covering broad aspects of sexual violence, that it should be inclusive of all gender identities, expressions, that Title IX is so much more than the handful of words that it is on paper. Once we start really establishing that and really pushing for these expansive, progressive definitions and interpretations of Title IX, that'll start to stick. Hopefully. And this idea of like trying to establish new precedent where not a lot has been there before, right? That is scary and again difficult and confusing to navigate, because we can see how easily different administrations' interpretations have changed the meanings of Title IX and have changed procedures and will continue to change procedures, right? So once we start, we're in a really weird space where I think thinking of Title IX and the interpretation of Title IX policy is still kind of in its infancy is kind of helpful in this sense. I think also like it's never bad to have a really awesome aggregate of data represented in a really cool map kind of way.
Yeah.
The statistics nerd inside of me is like, this is amazing still.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't have said it better. I agree. So I want to pivot a little bit to trying to talk a little bit about how we can use the map. I keep talking about comparing schools, seeing policies, seeing what your school doesn't have. You've been known to be a student activist in your time. How can students use this map in their activism? Or the data?
Yeah, I think we see students oftentimes in, unfortunately, acts of desperation almost, sharing, intimate stories of their own struggles with getting themselves heard and having a well-rounded reporting process and feeling like their Title IX rights have been disregarded by their schools, right? People have taken to social media, have taken Twitter, Instagram to share those stories, recording videos of themselves writing them down. And I think having the statistics to back that up, being able to bring that to like a board of trustees meeting, being able to bring that into both the public forum of social media or just around on campus, printing out that data, printing out the map, showing it to their friends, saying, hey, did you know about this? Building like that perhaps inside or even outside public pressure, and that is a way to use it as well.
I'm really glad you said that, because we hear stories a lot about student survivors advocating for themselves by printing out the Dear Colleague letters, or by printing out information about how to interpret Title IX and physically bringing it to their administrations and saying you owe me this. This is a civil rights law. This protects me. You need to show up. And that is certainly not possible for every individual person and requires a lot of support and privileges to get to that place. But being able to take this information and print it out and share it and bring it to people as a way to advocate for change, I think is really been the legacy of Title IX activism that we've seen recently. That you're one in a long line of people who is on the ground doing the work to say this is broken, this is wrong, and I know this goes back to having pride for your school. I know that you can do better, and I'm going to make sure that you do. Holding that institution accountable. Wow. What do you? This is not on the sheet, so we're gonna go off topic. But I suspect you have something great to say about this. How do you recommend students who are in schools who may be involved in a women's and gender center, or may be involved in some aspect of student activism, how do you recommend they bring other people into that conversation? What are some of the best practices for working across movements? Because we know that violence isn't going to end by fixing Title IX or ending sexual violence, that there's a much bigger world of liberation that we're working towards. How do you bring people along with you? What did you do?
Oh my goodness. I think this is an issue that movements outside of colleges face themselves, right? This idea that we like to say that we want to practice intersectionality, that we want to honor the fact that our issues are all interconnected, that there is no liberation for one of us until there is liberation for all of us, kind of sentiment. That is a beautiful sentiment. Putting it into practice is extremely difficult.
Yeah.
On college campuses, I think with the way that I understand student clubs to be set up, that there's a lot of competing over resources. There's a big push to program, to do events that will bring in large swaths of students. That's how I think a lot of student life offices measure the success of a club, is how many people they bring to a program.
Sure.
And when that happens, that type of programming isn't necessarily always political. It doesn't always want to get into difficult topics, right? You're there to have fun, and you want to come here and have fun. So I think one of the ways that my club tried to tackle this, and my club is termed a women's center, people as possible. We didn't limit it to, say, the social justice coalition of groups, although we really valued the input of groups like our Latin American student organization, of our organization for Black and Brown activists, for our Multicultural Students Association, the African Student Union. We valued that input absolutely, but we also reached out to things like the radio station. We talked to sports teams, anyone who would really listen to us, I guess. And we didn't immediately dive into like, here are all of the awful things that are happening around Title IX policy. Here's all the, you know, the traumatizing and awful stories we know about sexual violence on our campus. We started it off with like, hey, we see an opportunity for collaboration here. We kind of like dipped our toes into the water at first. There were groups that I think, there were some burned bridges and some institutional history in the past, because again, college groups have such high leadership turnover rates that it's hard to keep in contact with other groups, it's hard to keep in contact with the leadership. Sometimes other groups remember harm that was caused that you don't necessarily have the information for. So one of the things that we did was we just kept asking. When it came to this idea that we were a women's center, and that we wouldn't necessarily have, but the idea like sexual violence is like only women's issues, only like privileged white cis women's issue. We would try and like come up with examples of how that wasn't the case, and really try and invite people to offer up their own stories and their ways of relating to the issue that weren't necessarily like, you know, people didn't have to use all like the correct language around it. Like we weren't putting all this pressure on people to automatically know, I guess. So I hope that is helpful in some sense. Just keep trying, keep listening, stepping back, honoring other people's stories, trying to kind of guide people and kind of hold their hands and kind of bring them down this path of seeing that like sexual violence is an all-encompassing issue, and that it's tied up with the anti-racism movement, that it's tied up with like immigrants' rights, that it's it finds its way into other movements as well. But be respectful about it.
Wow. Yeah, incredible. Thank you for sharing that. No, it's really useful to hear it framed that way. And I think when you're talking about like making space to listen to other people's stories, about educating other folks, about not expecting them to get it right the first time, I think that's a real moment for student leaders to evaluate their own capacity, to evaluate their organization's capacity, their friends' capacity, and to make sure that the people who are leading those discussions are people who have the ability to do that work. Like that's a lot of labor, right? To have to like explain something to someone. And we should absolutely invite people in who don't have all of the correct language. That's the only way we're gonna do this and get everyone free. But also recognizing that like that's a real strategic leadership decision as well, to make sure that the people who are responsible for repairing those relationships and for doing that teaching are people who feel ready to do it, who have support to do it, and who are equipped to do it. So that's a really smart leadership move on your part as well.
I hope it was successful. I hope that the folks that I know who have remained on that campus continue that work through to the best of their abilities. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that. This is something that I like to talk about a lot when I talk to students is trying to reconcile with the fact that students are often at schools or on schools' campuses just for a brief period of time. It might be a year, it might be 2 years, it might be 4 years or 5 or 6, but it's not forever. And eventually you will likely move on. And trying to figure out what to do to ensure that all the work that you did while you were there doesn't have to get redone by the next generation. Did you struggle with that at all? What did you do to try to reconcile that?
I think I tried to give as many pep talks as possible. I think, the president of the organization before me is a wonderful person. I love her very, very dearly, but she's not very, she's very soft-spoken. She listens a lot more than she talks. I have the opposite problem. Her leadership style is like quiet, consistent support. Mine is very loud and some kind of in your face to some extent.
Sure.
And what was I going to say? The person who followed me and has taken up the presidency after I graduated is more of that type 2, a little bit quieter, and I think she felt like she had to be like me and had to lead like me, and I think there are so many different leadership styles. There are people who are much more collaborative. There are people who really like to take the helm and then kind of delegate tasks. There are folks who really like to solicit everyone's opinions before making any sort of decision. Recognizing that, yes, you don't want to have to kind of rebuild the same institutional knowledge and do the same work over and over again each year, but also having faith in people that you can only train them and prepare them so much, and then after that you really do have to take a step back. I don't want the new crop of leadership that has come up in the Women's Center to feel like I'm just breathing down their necks and that I have these like really big expectations for them. Because we did a lot of new stuff. When I was president, we collabed with I think 9 new groups that we had never interacted with really before, to our knowledge. We had done a lot of travel and a lot of lobbying, but I don't want them to feel like they have to do the same thing, that they have to do that again. If there's traditions that they really like and that they want to uphold, I have faith that they'll continue to do that. If they need my advice on something, they have my number. I'm on the you know what I mean? Like I'm part of the Facebook group, but I don't want to feel like I have to exert any sort of control or that I have to be. It's difficult. It's never perfect. There are probably going to be some things that I really liked that I wanted to see remain as part of that center that they're going to not do anymore, whether that's because they just don't have the capacity or they just don't think it's important. And that's fine, and you have to be okay with that. You have to, but I feel like the value is always going to stay the same. I think one of the things that there was a big kind of a cultural shift in our organization was we went from being this like kind of generic women's empowerment, rah-rah girl power, female CEOs kind of thing. Sure. To really thinking about like what is our ideology, what are our political goals, what is our agenda that way, and combining that with like respecting folks' identities and wanting to uplift those stories. So we became, I think, a lot more political than we were a social group before. I think that has remained. I think that value is going to stick around for a while. I think the folks who are in that group are still interested in that.
Yeah, I really appreciate your humility. Here's what I want, but also
I'm not there anymore.
Right. And I think that's also another for those people who are listening, who are student leaders, who are student activists, like remembering that like you did it one way and you learned one way, and that's really important. And you can give people information and you can equip them, but also everyone's on their own journey, and that there's value sometimes in having to learn the same lesson. You got a chance to learn it, and other people can have a chance to learn it. And also something I often like to talk about is figuring out ways to sort of like track and hold institutional knowledge. So since people are turning over so frequently, having systems within your organization for documenting meetings, documenting conversations you had so that someone can look back at it and see what you've learned. Identifying allies on your campus, at your school, if there's professors that have been there for a long time, like using them as sort of a like repository for that information, and making sure the leaders after you are connected with that person and know that they can go to that person for institutional knowledge. And also just like creating and it sounds like you're doing a lot of this, like creating an environment where like the story of what you do on a daily basis and how you act can give some of that knowledge to people, that you can say like, this is what we do, like this is who we are, we moved in this direction, and these are the values we have, and that like that in of itself is sort of a measure of having learned and grown and institutional knowledge, and that in the story that you tell about the work you did and the organization that you led, that you can kind of hide those nuggets of information in there.
If your school has any sort of historical archives, like check in with your librarians, because first of all, librarians are amazing.
Yes.
But there was so much about the Women's Center that we didn't know about in its kind of infancy in the 1970s when it really cropped up on our campus for the first time. It was originally a political caucus. And it was trying to get Shirley Chisholm elected to the presidency.
Sure.
Right? It was trying to do these things that the group when we kind of, myself and my group of friends that kind of took up the leadership, weren't seeing, right? So when we had a project in one of our classes, myself and some of the other folks involved in the group, that involved going down to the archives and really looking at those photos and really seeing that. So check to see if your group's been around for decades. Check to see if there's any sort of like university records of your group's activism. Also, they didn't have Google Drive in the 70s, but they have it now.
Right.
So like having so much, like you said, like taking records of your minutes. I left a bunch of stuff, like lobbying 101 things that I created for meetings. Those are still on our drive. So
Yeah.
our record, if you are a student leader on campus and you have some sort of, again, a repository for that information, a little like paragraph about what your day was like volunteering for EROC.
Right.
Put that in there.
Be the archivist you wish to see in the world.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for joining me and for offering your wealth of knowledge and personal experience, and also for adding to this programming that we're doing today that's new and exciting and is sort of pushing us in a new direction in our work. I wanted to give you the opportunity, if there's anything that you feel like you wanted to say or haven't covered yet, to get your last bits of advice in before we sign off. What are you going to say to future leaders?
I think I've talked enough, but just like thank you. We believe in you. It's not possible for us to do this work at EROC without students and without student survivors. So
Yeah, that's right. I really appreciate that.
that's my message.
And hang in there.
Yeah.
Reach out to us if you need support. We're here for you.
Absolutely.
On that note, if you liked what you heard today, if you want to know more about what we're doing, sign up for our newsletter. You can do it on our website. You can also email media@ndrakeoncampus.org if you have some more questions about how to do that. You can also sign up for our rapid response listserv. You can follow us on social. We're on Twitter. We have a Facebook page. Hopefully you're watching it right now. We're on Instagram. You can follow us there. Shout us out. Send us DMs. Tag us and stuff. If you have pictures of yourself filling out the form today and you want to tag it with EROC Geo, go for it. If you want to add songs to our playlist, let us know. We'll put them on there. Keep asking your questions. Keep reaching out to us. If you have questions about the form, you can always email map@ndrakeoncampus.org. We're here to help with the technical pieces of that. And then also check out the student organizing toolkit that we have on our website that has information about self-care and about events you can hold on campus, and you can take some of Kimberly's amazing advice and start to implement it there. And also check out our programming page. We have an amazing programming director here at EROC who assisted us so much today in making this happen. And we can come to your campus. We can do workshops, we can come to your school, we can send speakers. We're here to support you in the work that you're doing on campus. I'm going to take a moment of privilege to just thank everyone at EROC who was involved today. Kimberly and Betsy, our communications team you can't see right now, Morgan and Laura, who have put so much work into making this possible and figuring out technological snafus and answering your questions online. And also Michelle, who's our programming director, who was an invaluable thought partner in making this happen. That's it for us.
Yeah.
Keep taking care of yourself, fill out the map, tell your friends, shout us out, let us know what you're up to. We love hearing about what you're doing, and it helps us stay present and focused and on track to keep doing this work. We so appreciate you being with us today and all the labor that you put into everything you're doing for the map, and we hope to see you soon.